Hello, friends, and welcome to the May 26th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with the Texas Legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we wrap up Weekly Witness for the legislative session with a conversation with Every Texan's senior fiscal analyst, Dick Lavine, talking about tax policy, which is still contentious with hours to go in the legislative session. But before we get to that conversation, y'all, it has been a wild ride. We'll have a session wrap-up series in a few weeks, and in the meantime, I'll miss you. But this session has been unlike any other, and we're going to have some serious conversations in the next few months. Many of us spent some time this week reflecting on the one-year anniversary of the Uvalde massacre, and I remember recording a podcast in the hours following the tragedy. I remember many of us saying that we wouldn't forget, that we would stay mad. There have been so many things this session that were wrong, that were incompatible with our faith values. There was not nearly enough listening to impacted voices or representatives from communities, and we need to do better. We need our legislature to be better. But in order for that to happen, those of us who have been paying attention have to remember, have to share the story and engage our communities in this work. And that work doesn't start in January 2025. It has to start in June 2023. I found hope this week in meeting with faith leaders in Houston about our soon-to-be-announced Houston Faith Votes campaign, and was inspired at their willingness to roll up their sleeves and get to work engaging their communities and congregations. In order for change to take place, the faith community is going to have to play a leading role. And I've been inspired by your work in doing just that this session, and want to thank you for making us a part of your advocacy journey. In post-session, let's be honest, first I look forward to taking a nap, but then look forward to reemerging with you all to do the work that it's going to take to create a more just and equitable Texas. We look forward to partnering with you in that work. To make sure that you're staying up to date, go to texasimpact.org and the Action Center and sign up for the teams and groups that interest you. If you have questions, hit me up at scott@texasimpact.org. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Dick Lavine. Joining us for today's conversation is a longtime friend of the program, Dick Lavine, senior fiscal analyst with Every Texan. Dick, thanks for joining us.
Of course, always my pleasure.
We are in the almost closing hours now of legislative session. We're recording this on Thursday. How are you holding up?
Well, I do as much as I can, and then when I run out of things to do, I go home.
I love that. I hope they all go home soon and maybe stay home for a while. I know all of us in the advocacy realm would certainly appreciate that. But our topic for today is one that is certainly still at the forefront of voters' minds, of the legislature's minds, and has been for the entirety of the legislative session. So it seems like we've been talking about property taxes in this legislature since, I don't know, November or something like that. And here we are with a couple days left in session and we're still going. So the House and Senate both prioritized property tax cuts this session, but their approaches have been different, I guess, to say the least. Where are we now in the process? And again, this is as of Thursday afternoon.
Okay.
And how would you evaluate the different alternatives?
Well, last I heard, the Senate version called Senate Bill 3, just to give you an indication of the priority, was sent to the House. The House put in a different idea of how to cut taxes and sent it back to the Senate. And I honestly do not know where it is in the process right now, but we do know, assuming it's not considered a tax, if it's considered a tax bill, they've got to finish and lay out the conference committee report, the agreement between the House and the Senate, by Friday midnight. And then it has to pass both the House and the Senate by Sunday midnight.
So talk some about the different approaches that both the House and Senate are taking. Why have they had trouble finding agreement?
Well, there's really not very many moving parts to this. The Senate had more. They had actually with Senate Bill 3, 4, and 5, but only Senate Bill 3's moved forward. And essentially what the Senate wants to do is raise the homestead exemption. Right now, the homestead exemption for most people is $40,000, meaning when you calculate the taxable value of your home, let's say your home is worth $300,000, you only pay taxes on $260,000. They subtract $40,000 out. And then the rest of the tax cut in the bill was just by reducing the tax rate for school property taxes by about, I think it was about 7 or 8 cents in that version. But, think that part's the easy part to change. On the House side, they seem, for whatever reason, enamored of an appraisal cap. Now, right now, we do have an appraisal cap. It's 10%, and it applies only to homesteads. What that means is the taxable value of your home can't go up more than 10% a year, even if your market value has gone up much more than that. And I live in Austin, not this year, but last year, my market value and my appraised value went up 60%.
Oh, wow.
And I did, in fact, protest, but what could I say? That was pretty accurate. But my taxable value only went up 10%. What the House would do is lower the appraisal cap from 10% to 5%, and more importantly, apply it to all property, all business property, commercial and industrial, and everything else. So it'd have a much bigger impact on the tax base from which school districts and cities and counties have to raise the money needed to fund public services.
Right.
Because the appraisal cap the rate cut would only be for school districts. The appraisal cap would affect your taxable value for all property taxes. And then the House also had a rate cut. And the thing is, they can decide on how much they want the grand total to be and do either homestead exemption or an appraisal cap, and then just adjust the rate cut to whatever fits. It really sort of makes it quite easy. So the state budget is now ready to be voted on. Again, it's called the Conference Committee Report. It means the House passed a budget, the Senate passed a budget, they met together and they reached some kind of agreement. And there is a line in there, I believe it's $17.6 billion, which happens to be just about half of the so-called surplus. We prefer to call it the ending cash balance. It's the money that Texas would have at the end of this fiscal year, given, its other expenditures. And that's been the pledge from the beginning. We'd give half of this so-called surplus back in tax cuts. The budget doesn't specify how you do that, and the House and Senate haven't agreed on how they want to get it done either. Although, as I say, there's only appraisal caps, yes, no, how big, homestead exemption, yes, no, how big, and rate cut, which I think is going to be a yes, to tell you the truth, and how big. And that's it. So mathematically, it's not that difficult. I forgot to mention, incidentally, about the homestead exemption. On the Senate side, the original proposal was to raise that $40,000 that we all have right now to $70,000. When the House took the Senate bill and they sent it back, they proposed $100,000. I honestly don't know if they're being serious or whether they're sort of, putting their finger in the eye of the Senate saying, you think you're so great, we can do better than that. Who knows what goes on with these people?
Yeah. So in thinking about all of these different conversations, I know many of our listeners are probably doing math in their head about how this is going to impact them, and their family. But help us think through how you'd evaluate each one of the different approaches in terms of the appraisal caps, the homestead exemptions, and the rate cuts, and how those would impact public policy in Texas moving forward.
Okay. Because as you started to mention, a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do for me. We don't talk about it that way. We don't think we should be cutting taxes. And especially when you see what the legislature has done or actually failed to do in terms of funding our schools and taking care of our people in many different ways in health and human services. So we don't think you should be doing tax cuts at all. But I can tell you about the advantages and disadvantages of the three approaches. The advantage of the appraisal cap, and when we say if you're going to cut taxes, which you shouldn't, but if you are, the appraisal cap the homestead exemption is probably the best way to go. Because let's say you raise the homestead exemption by $30,000. If your school taxes say roughly $1, that's $300 off your tax bill. And that is $300 for every homeowner. For a homeowner of a small home, a homeowner of a big home, doesn't matter what your family income, you're still going to get pretty much the very same number of dollars. And obviously, $300 means a lot more to people who don't have a lot of money than it does to people who do have a lot of money. So it's progressive in its way. So if you're going to cut taxes, raising the homestead exemption is not a bad way to do it. The appraisal cap, on the other hand, is not at all a good way to do it. And it leads you further and further away from what should be the basis, the foundation of property taxation, which is based on market value and everybody with a similar property being taxed the same. What appraisal caps does, it leads to this phenomenon called welcome neighbor. Let's say here I live in this very nice house, and I mentioned that because of where I live in Austin, its value has gone up quite a bit. But because of the appraisal cap, I'm right now paying on probably 2/3 of its real market value. What if somebody moves in across the street in a house just like mine, worth just as much as mine? They're going to be paying on the full market value of that house, because when you move, the appraisal cap disappears and it gets reset again at market value. And you say, welcome neighbor, because he's going to be paying, actually it works out 50% more to support our schools, even though we have the same house and presumably the same ability to pay. And with the 5% cap, it just makes it that much worse. I figured if there had been the 5% cap in place since we bought this house, which was some time ago, I'd be paying on 1/3 of the real market value, which is just completely unfair compared to somebody who's just bought a house and is buying on full market value. And then when you apply it to businesses, business property tends to be more volatile than residential property. And I was told that hotels in particular, because I guess, the hotels are actually more valued on their income. And sometimes they fill up and sometimes they don't. And the trouble is, if their market value were to ever drop, it would probably take forever to get back to its real market value. So an appraisal cap to begin with, and especially a lower appraisal cap applying to all property, would just distort the property tax system entirely. Then the third element is the rate cut. This is on your school taxes. The way that the school finance system is rigged now for school districts, as your property values go up, you have to lower your rate so that your net revenue doesn't go up by, as it happens, 2.5% a year. Well, over time, values are going to go up and the rates are going to go down. So, if they have a little patience, their rates would go down anyway. There's no reason to be in a hurry to cut them, especially when we have so many better things we could be doing with this money. But they seem fixated on this. Now, let me say this, and I hate to be quoted, but Dan Patrick is right. Dan Patrick really wants to cut rates. And he recognizes if, because of appraisal caps, your values are going to go up more slowly, then your rates are going to come down more slowly. And if what you want is rapid decrease in your school property tax rate, then an appraisal cap just gets in the way. And that's really the major difference between the House and the Senate. It's not that hard to figure out a compromise. You have the appraisal cap be 7.5%, and the homestead exemption, instead of 70, make it 85,000. I mean, just split the baby, right? But yeah. I don't know if that's the way they think.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. Again, you said this is all happening in the next couple of days, if it's going to happen. I assume they have to get this done before they can take up the budget, or?
No, they can pass the budget with that undefined $17.6 billion and figure out how to spend the $17.6 billion separately, or pass the budget now and come back sometime later after, in a special session and figure out how to spend it.
Shh, we're not talking about that now,
Sorry.
Dick. Come on. we're wanting a summer and a break from the Texas Legislature. But yeah, all good things to watch. But one way or another, this is going to, in theory, come to an end soon. And there are a lot of folks who care about the property tax issue, care about funding important services, but a lot of this is implemented locally. So what advice would you give to Texans who want to stay engaged on local tax issues?
Okay, well, let me start at an individual level. People probably a month ago got their notice of appraised value, what the appraisal district thinks your house is worth, minus the homestead exemption that we have now and various other things. If you're not satisfied with that, you should protest. I happened to see in Travis County, 165,000 people protested their appraisal. It is your right, and you should do it. You can do it online, actually, in Travis County and probably in all the big urban counties. And if you do want to go in person, you can have an informal hearing with an appraiser from the district. If you're not satisfied with that, you can go to the Appraisal Review Board, which is 3 citizens who've been appointed by a local judge to listen to what you have to say, and of course, listen to what the appraisal district has to say and pick a number. And then there's things past that most people don't get to. The thing is, though, that just knowing what your taxable value is only half the equation. The other half is what's the rate. And the rate is set by the city council or the commissioner's court or the school board or the community college, hospital district, whoever else. They pick the rate that, if applied to the value in that city or county, will get them the amount of money they need to fund the services they want to provide through the budget. You should go. You can go and you can testify. And you can testify about how you want more services, or you think this service is wasteful. Whatever it is, that's your opportunity. This is on like a macro level, to go talk to your elected officials about how you think they ought to be spending your money.
Yeah, so you talked about Senate Bill 3, but House Bill 5 is another really important issue that I know you've been working hard on. Talk to us some about that.
Okay, House Bill 5, and you can tell by the low number, this is a really important bill for the Speaker, is essentially a continuation of the Chapter 313 program you might have heard about that was not renewed last session. And essentially what it is it's school property tax abatements that are allegedly necessary to attract businesses to move to Texas. So the way it's set up, let's say you move into a large urban area and you put in $1 billion in your plant, you're only going to pay as if it were worth $100 million. In fact, if you put in $10 billion in a semiconductor fab, you'd still only pay as if that was worth $100 million. That's a 99% tax break, and it's a lot. There's many aspects to it, but one important one is under Chapter 313, school districts were getting kickbacks from the company of a percentage of their tax savings, the percentage that they weren't going to have to pay because they were only paying on $100 million. And it sort of settled in that school districts were going to get $100 per student per year for at least 13 years, the length of the agreement, more or less. And our school districts are just being starved to death, and they are so desperate that they virtually never said no to these deals. Didn't matter whether it was good for their community, didn't matter whether the odds were really good this company was going to come anyway and pay full freight like the rest of us have to. They were just rubber stamping the thing. And one important difference between the House and Senate bills as we speak now, things are going to change. But right now, Senator Schwertner, the Senate sponsor, said no more kickbacks. And they wrote pretty tight language saying it's just completely forbidden for anybody to give the school district anything of value to encourage them to sign this agreement. So we'll see. There have been many, many other changes. But if this bill does pass, and I hope it doesn't, to see in the future whether school districts, if they don't get paid to say yes, might start saying no and might start saying we don't need this in our community. Or we think they're going to come anyway, so let them pay taxes so our homeowners don't. Whatever it is, it could be a big change in what had been this Chapter 313 program. But we will see in the next few days.
So that's actually. Yes, that's currently in conference committee as of Thursday afternoon.
I haven't checked, but I suspect it is. If it's not in conference, It will be within a matter of hours.
Yeah. Okay. So certainly something to watch over the course of the next few days.
That for this bill, unlike the budget and the tax bill, if it's considered that, they have until Saturday midnight to reach an agreement and lay it out, and Sunday midnight to pass it in both the House and Senate. Monday, maybe.
All right. We'll definitely have a lot of opportunities for people to engage during the interim, but I wonder if you have anything that you're already thinking about that folks should be talking to legislators about over the course of the next year.
Yeah, well, we'll see how everything turns out. But the first thing I would ask the legislatures is, you must be kidding. You had all this money and you didn't do more for schools? What are you thinking? The school finance is based on what's called the basic allotment, certain amount of money, and then you multiply by the number of students and you adjust for the student demographics. Do they speak English at home? Are they low income? Are they special needs? Whatever it is. Well, that basic allotment probably was too low 2 sessions ago, and they haven't changed it since. It was, I can't remember exactly, I think it was $6,160. And the proposals are just insulting to raise it by 120 or 50 or something, when just to keep up with inflation, it's got to be raised $1,000, and it was inadequate to begin with. The 6,100 really ought to be like 7,500. Yeah. And they haven't done a thing about it. Instead, they're talking about appraisal caps versus homestead exemption. It is infuriating. And when your legislator comes home, if you feel the way I do, you should let them have it, because there's no excuse.
Let him have it. I think there will be several people echoing that message over the course of the next few weeks. Dick, really appreciate the time today. Any other closing thoughts or shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with?
No. At this point in the session, people are tired. I'll have to say, honestly, people are a little disgusted by some of what they've seen. But, you got to hang in there. Things aren't going to get better unless you make them get better. So that's what I'm telling people. Stay involved.
Stay involved, friends. And Dick, this is the last weekly witness conversation we'll have during the legislative session. I really appreciate you closing out this time over the last 140 days. And we'll join you in saying we've all got some work to do in the next couple of months to make sure some of this doesn't happen again. But really do appreciate the time, and thanks for all you do.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
And that's a wrap on Weekly Witness episodes recorded during this regular session of the Texas Legislature. I'd like to thank Dick for the time and thank you for tuning in throughout the course of the session. As I said in the open, we're probably going to be taking a few weeks away, and then we'll jump back in probably with a legislative wrap-up series. Whatever it is, you'll love it, I promise. If you have ideas for the program during the interim or questions about Texas Impact and our opportunities, feel free to reach out at scott@texasimpact.org. But for now, make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast and are sharing it with your friends and congregations, and consider joining Texas Impact to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode and the regular session of the Texas Legislature. So remember, The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged, both during the legislative session and beyond. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.